Is your vague perception of the 2000 election something like a trivia question or an answer to a trivia question, and that you kind of remember it as that weird time, the first time in a while, where someone with more popular votes lost the Electoral College and it went to the Supreme Court, and it was all that kind of vague chaos, but nothing really quite settled right after because, I mean, heck, George Bush was in office after for 8 years. Well, if that's your impression of the 2000 election, it's better than most people's. But if you come to this podcast to find out everything else that you need to know about how exactly George Bush got into office for 8 straight years, well, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Hidden History. On today's episode, we'll be breaking down. In this episode, we'll take you through some of the craziest moments of the election. From election night itself, how did that Florida call happen? Why did Al Gore concede? And how did the mainstream media take shape around a narrative that came from a surprising place? And then, of course, the hanging chads, the Brooks Brothers riots, the fight over the recount, how that came to play, and how that came to be resolved. All on the home turf of George Bush's brother, Jeb. It's one of the most fascinating and probably, in my opinion, undertold stories in American recent electoral history, and has such a grave consequence for the rest of the century up until this point, which is, it's set off the century, frankly, on a very interesting track. Al Gore versus George Bush, talking about the war on terror, talking about NSA, talking about the economy, how he would have handled all those things. Al Gore may not have been perfect, but he certainly would have been a fair bit better than George W. Bush. And it all kind of starts on election night. It had been, up until that point, obviously a very close campaign, as I'm sure some of our older listeners would have been around for. The campaign leading up to the crazy election night was a pretty normal campaign. We saw the candidates stick to relatively, typical of the 90s at that time, pretty much social issues. There was some griping over the Clinton administration's handling of Somalian troops, but Bill Clinton's sex scandal and just general immorality was really tied to Al Gore at the time. It was something, he had to really make out with his wife on stage to try and disapprove the allegations of there. Both vice presidents got very heavily involved, with Joe Lieberman and, of course, Dick Cheney. There was standard 3 presidential debates. Of course, we also had Ralph Nader, successful left-wing option to Al Gore, who really pushed, in a lot of ways, Al Gore to kind of adjust and get a little bit skittish towards the end. Many people do blame Ralph Nader a little bit for spoiling the Al Gore campaign. Could he have won easier? It's certainly a possibility. But as it comes down to it, come to election night, all the states kind of file in very similar to the way that they do now. Al Gore does a little bit better than normal in the South, and is not, pretty much wins kind of every single standard state. He does a little bit better in the Midwest, winning Iowa, which is kind of an unexpected state for a Democrat to win today. And Bush even comes up pretty solid in New Hampshire, but the big performances of New York, California, Oregon, the coasts, and then solidly, of course, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota in the Democratic camp work out to pretty well in Gore's favor. And of course, it all comes down to Florida. Gore is very, very close in with winning Florida, and Gore was actually behind by a very small amount, or roughly 2,000 or so votes, but it looked like, based on the numbers, Gore would come back to win. The networks call it for Al Gore. Al Gore is the president at that time. This was just around 7:57 p.m. Eastern Time. They make the call to confirm Gore president.
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column. This is a state both campaigns desperately wanted to win.
And with that projection, it becomes pretty well clear that Gore is on his way to win the presidency. And meanwhile, though, there was something happening behind the scenes. The George Bush camp, recognizing really the momentum was very much in their way, they made a few phone calls. And it turns out one of the phone calls that they made was to the Fox News decision desk, where Howard Kurtz, who was a Washington Post media reporter at the time, reported on what happened next. The head of Fox News' election night decision desk, who first recommended calling Florida and the election for George W. Bush in complete contradiction of all the other networks, as you just heard, CNN, their call at the time. Other networks were following suit with CNN. It turned out that George W. Bush's first cousin, his name was John Ellis, was on the phone with Jebby, as he called him, the governor of Florida, and the presidential candidate himself, giving them updated assessments of the vote count. And I don't know if you've watched the recent Succession, that not even Logan Roy would allow something like that at Fox News, though that was commonplace at the time. So John Ellis was on the phone getting all sorts of grief from Jeb Bush and from doubtless people in the Bush campaign, probably Cheney, probably Bush himself. But Ellis's projection was, of course, crucial because Fox News Channel put Florida in the W column, as in George W. Bush, at 2:16 a.m., followed by NBC, CBS, CNN, and ABC within 4 minutes. The decision turned out to be wrong and was retracted by the embarrassed networks less than 2 hours later, but it forever created the impression that Bush had won. It was a huge, huge moment, and it was engineered completely by John Ellis, who was getting all sorts of grief on the phone, as was reported at the time by Howard Kurtz of the Washington Post, who was then, of course, went on to work at Fox News. That Fox News was getting all sorts of grief to make that call, and because of Fox's aggression, because of Fox sticking their neck out there, all the other networks got scared. They were like, what if we went wrong? This was a big problem. And if we screw up to call the presidential election and Fox News gets it right, they are going to look so good compared to us. You can imagine how it looked if the liberal media calls for Gore, and then, the stakes were so high for them to possibly even risk getting it wrong. Okay, so I know a lot of people listening to this, if you don't know who Cenk Uygur is of TYT, it's good for you, but he is a little bit controversial. But he is a host of this very popular online kind of left-wing YouTube show, and he explains, I think, so well the dynamic and the amount of pressure that people were under in this clip. Kind of remembering, this is actually in the context of a eulogy for Roger Ailes, the head of Fox at the time.
Roger Ailes hired a person to run the vote count in the 2000 election at Fox News. You know who that person was? It was George W. Bush's cousin. And you know what happened on that fateful night when George W. Bush lost the popular vote and it was a statistical tie in Florida? There's no way that any reasonable, objective news organization should have called that election either way on that night. But there was one player in so-called news that was not reasonable or objective, that was intended to be Republican propaganda, and boy, he nailed it on that night. He had George Bush's cousin call the election, and the rest of the failures in the news media, as usual, went along with Roger Ailes and what had to be, you gotta give him credit, his genius plan there. He said, look, I'll call it Fox News, I'll say it's fair and balanced, and I gotta be honest with you, the rest of the mainstream media, you were all schmucks. And you played right into his hands. And there was story after story throughout all the years of how CNN and MSNBC executives would be watching what Fox News was doing and say, whoa, they're talking about it a lot, so I guess we should get on it. We don't want to be late.
Yeah, so that's just one narrative, but it shows you that was all the impression they needed. It was taken back by the other networks a few hours later, but that impression, the graphics, George W. Bush, elected president, by every single solitary network, that was still there and was there quite strongly. So then what follows next is really just an incredible turn of events. And so the networks retract, but Fox News keeps the call. But meanwhile, Wednesday, November 8th comes, day after the election, some uncertainty, but it's quickly seized by Katherine Harris, the Florida Secretary of State, Jeb Bush's close ally and co-chair of this campaign in the state, which is really quite incredible. And she announced that George Bush had won Florida. That meant he would be president. Meanwhile, the margin in Florida was shrinking to a sliver, and the Republicans were going for going for the presidency, but a recount had been triggered, and this was something that they, for some reason, for whatever reason, were completely freaked out about. So as it stands, Harris, the Secretary of State, closely associated with the Bush campaign, and the Bush governor, again, was the statewide campaign co-chair for George W. Bush during the 2000 election, and just so happened to be in charge of counting the votes in the most critical state in the election, had certified the race, and it seemed quite early. However, the margin was so small that the Florida law required a machine recount of the state, which reduced Bush's lead to 327. The presidential choice on about 170,000 ballots could not be read by the machine. So these were some outstanding ballots, which made the election incredibly close. And of these, 6,000 were undervotes. For instance, the voter had not fully punched through the ballot's relevant perforated box. The remaining 110,000 were overvotes, in which the voter may have voted normally for Bush or Gore, but also wrote in their name. And these 170,000 ballots were not really factored into the count, meaning, the ballots that could possibly swing the election for Gore would be left out of the recount unless Gore was successful in suing. And that is what they did. They requested a recount by hand in 4 heavily Democratic counties, and the Bush campaign sued to stop this. The Gore campaign's efforts then disappeared for the next month into a mind-numbingly complex legal process, overflowing with ballot design and deadline minutia that no normal American could follow. It was taken out of the ability of the public to really fully understand what was going on with probably the most important civic process they could possibly undertake. Meanwhile, the Republican Party conducted a nationwide PR campaign with a message Americans could follow, that Gore was a sore loser who could not accept he had been defeated. I mean, the Secretary of State, the top election certification official of the state, had come out and said that George Bush had won. I mean, what was Gore still doing? He must not have cared about democracy. And chances are, if you ask, especially a liberal, about Gore, they may say something along the lines of, oh, well, at least he knew when to stop fighting. He knew when to put the sword down. He knew when to admit defeat for the good of the country. And the root of that, because obviously that is what did end up happening, the root of, oh, the responsibility is on Gore to, step aside and serve the country, the root of that idea came from the Republican Party and people like Dick Cheney in the Bush campaign who were pushing this ideology. A friendly appeals court then stopped the Florida Democrats' push for a recount, the National Democrats' push for a recount in the Gore campaign, but then the Florida Supreme Court reversed the decision, allowing the recount to go forward. Republicans then appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. So the recount, as was being put before the Supreme Court, was centered around trying to analyze these outstanding 170,000 ballots and looking at what decision was the voter intending. So if the voter by accident maybe put Pat Buchanan and they were in a precinct that voted 100% Democrat, then it was very likely that they meant to vote for Gore because he was next on the voter rolls. If they had maybe mistakenly put a perforated hole that wasn't exactly quite right, but it was clear what they were trying to go, well, it was okay because it was clear what the voter intent was. So that was the Florida Supreme Court standard. The problem with that was it was not very specific because different counties used different standards. And another instance where we see, again, Al Gore, in his very much kind of lack of aggression, his coming right off his eagerness to concede to George W. Bush before the votes were counted. This was right before kind of for the good of the election, for the good of the country, all that stuff. What he was quite eager to succeed, and he did get concede. He then, of course, unconceded. But when he was getting a bunch of pressure from some of his advisors or more people on the outside pushing him to ask the Supreme Court to look at a more specific recount. And that, while it may not have helped him the best, it would have given the Supreme Court no excuse to say, well, this standard doesn't quite fit because each county in Florida uses a different voting standard. It uses a different voting method, or not all counties use the same, so it violates the equal protection clause of the Constitution that voters should all be treated the same way under the law. It violates that, which is, of course, what the Supreme Court did. Now, had Gore asked the Supreme Court to look at the voting standards one way, treat every single vote the same way, no matter regardless of counties, regardless of previous standards, because this was a special emergency single statewide recount, Supreme Court might have had another way, or may have had their excuse kind of taken away. But this was, according to Gore's advisors, going to cause a tremendous uproar. So Gore, being the good liberal that he was, refused to do it and eventually conceded for the good of the country. But while part of this is on Gore, I think it is, just Gore's weakness and Gore's complete bowing to pressure in the face of a real scandalous push for the presidency that was completely extrajudicial, completely outside of, standard democratic norms. A lot of this does have to do with the behavior of the institutions. The fact that there were familial connections all up and down this situation, with Kathleen Harris, with John Ellis, with Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother being the governor of Florida. There are these deep ties, these deep connections, and people where it really, really showed you, throughout this recount, we had, the Republicans causing massive scenes with the infamous Brooks Brothers riot organized by James Baker alongside Republican lawyers. Just the entire establishment Republican side coming down like a ton of bricks to make it seem like everything was chaotic, everything was out of control. There was just lawlessness happening. The Democrats were trying to do this recount because they were just completely sore losers. There was TV cameras eating up images of these well manicured, these well put together. They created the image of chaos while actually really creating chaos, creating image of Democratic run chaos to the media, but really creating chaos inside these voting centers. Voting centers recounts, especially in Miami-Dade, where obviously they wanted to do the most recounting, the Democrats did, was shut down because of the violence and the threats of violence that were made by these Brooks Brothers, Republican staffers, people like Roger Stone and other kind of sleazy Republican representatives were putting this together at the time. But of course, this was being also run by James Baker, who was organizing this, who has done a gazillion stitch-ups for Republican presidents from Reagan through George H.W. Bush through W. Bush, and that really had a pretty dramatic effect in causing the chaos and really making the country just, fear. What if we don't have a transition? What if we don't have a president? There was this real kind of urge that if we didn't get this sorted out by January 20th, the world would end. It would be like Y2K. It would be an absolute shambles. So we may have just have Al Gore concede for the good of the country. And that was an image that just didn't have to be. It was an image that was manufactured by things like the Brooks Brothers, by things like Fox News, and by Republican operatives pulling every single possible lever of power they had, from familial connections and, and endorsements from people and support from people who they knew in positions of power, through calling in operatives to do these, these crazy riots, and obviously complete full and aggressive media coverage from the right that kind of shamed and embarrassed liberal centrist media into kind of following their lead and really just making their narrative for them. With Bush now just about to force Al Gore to capitulate here, it was now time for the Supreme Court to come in and finish their job. And that was helped by the respectable conservative justice at the time, Sandra Day O'Connor, who, according to new reporting, provided the early framework that steered the outcome of the dispute over the 2000 presidential election, ensured that George W. Bush would win the White House over Gore, according to Supreme Court documents released way later. Memos found this newly opened files from Justice John Paul Stevens. They offered a first ever view behind the scenes of negotiations on the Bush v. Gore case at the court. And of course, it was a pretty tense time, and it really revealed how O'Connor, who is a justice that was pretty well steeped and was pretty understood to be politically knowledgeable from her days all the way back to her time in the Arizona legislature, partnered with Anthony Kennedy, effectively squeezing out an argument advanced by then Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Pretty much was the key there, was essentially how to handle this, how to deal with this problem, this inconvenient truth of the fact that they were stopping a recount that would probably go on to determine things quite differently than what the conservative majority would have wanted. So the influential Sandra Day O'Connor was able to get out there and get her opinion across. Her circulating that 4-page memo early on in the proceedings before the oral arguments may have guaranteed that her and other conservative Justice Anthony Kennedy had the greatest influence on the final per curiam opinion that spoke for a 5-justice majority, even though it was meant to at least technically speak for the whole court. Those 5 conservative justices were Sandra Day O'Connor, Kennedy, William Rehnquist, Antonin Scalia, and Clarence Thomas. And the 4 liberal justices, David Souter, Stevens, John Paul Stevens, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Breyer, angrily dissented. The court's views mirrored deep divisions in the country after an election that for weeks remained too close to call. But that per curiam unsigned opinion really kind of showed how the court took the lead and abandoned some major precedent in the past. It was, again, another one of these institutions saying, don't look too hard about what happened here. Don't, this decision, they also made sure it wouldn't be used not in any precedent for any future cases. They knew what they were doing was something that was completely out of the ordinary, completely, due to quote-unquote special circumstances. And it was clear, a certain sect of the Supreme Court conservative majority that had been really fought for by many, many powerful people, as we see the organization and the infrastructure that's in place now, that was just as strong back then with the Federalist Society, Leonard Leo, all that, taking their opportunity to say, here, we in the Supreme Court can help to install an American president, and we are going to do it in a way that kind of separates this case from all the others, takes it out of any kind of reasonable conversation, and within the broader legacy of the Supreme Court and their casework, and say, you know what, this was a weird situation, and in the words of Antonin Scalia, quote, get over it. And with that being said, even though a independent NORC analysis of some of the votes, or pretty much all the votes, every single possible recount method, every single possible standard they could have used, Al Gore would have won Florida and the presidency. Every single possible one. Only the margins would have changed a little bit. It would have been very close. But if those recounts would have been allowed to continue, Al Gore would have been president, and we very well could have avoided things like the Iraq War, the entire kind of war on terror, the response to Katrina, the response to the housing crisis, and the lead up to the global recession. So, and that was all really through a few tricks of fate, a few lucky appointments, a few key phone calls between friends, and finally, the decision of our nation's highest court to completely usurp the democratic will of the voters. With that being said, that is all we have for Hidden History this week. We'll be back next week. Thank you so much for listening, and hope you just understood a little bit more about one of the crazier elections in our history.